So Anna Leishing is the Curator of Art here at the National Museums of Northern Ireland, specifically here at the Ulster Museum. She's responsible for the exhibition and development of multiple aspects of the art collections, including works of art on paper, the Arts Council of Northern Ireland gifted collection, performance art, installation practice, and women painters. And she herself researches the underrepresentation of women artists and the essential role of artists as activists. She's working currently on a part-time PhD through the Belfast School of Art on women painters associated with the North of Ireland, 1957 to 1969. And she writes also independently for arts organisations and artists. And Anna's going to speak to us this afternoon on the subject of Never Static, Alice Berger Hammerschlag's impact on Belfast. So, Anna.
Thank you, Peter, and hello again. And also thank you very much again to Alison and Ruth for inviting me to speak today. It's wonderful to kind of get a chance to start sharing the very beginnings of a research project. Before I begin, I feel I must give an introduction to my introduction, which I'm constantly introducing today, because I'm very aware of my audience today, and I'm also aware that when I set off outlining this particular research project, it can come across that I'm being critical or unappreciative of the work of past art critics and historians of the North of Ireland, specifically critical of John Hewitt. And I am going to critique his activity today, but I just want to outline that I do credit him and his wife Roberta for their incredible contribution to the visual art in Belfast and for establishing the foundation of the art collection that's held here at the Ulster Museum. And I constantly like to remind people, and I want to remind you as well here today, that it's your art collection, you own it, you have a right to it, you have a right to access to it, you have a right to challenge me on what's on display and what isn't on display. And I know my thinking aligns with Hewitt's on that public ownership of art. I also have great appreciation for his work in the Herbert Gallery in Coventry, which is another place that has become a touch point in my own career. When I started here in the museum nearly 15 years ago, on my first day I was sent to Coventry, and luckily they took me back, but it's been a funny kind of touch point throughout the last 15 years. And what I'm going to argue here, and what I'm constantly arguing kind of in my wider work, and it's really the reason that I co-founded the Northern Irish Art Network, is that there's not been enough critical discourse, recording or analysis on the visual arts here in the North. And the reason that Hewitt ends up kind of being the main victim in my own analysis is because he was one of the very few who did create a critical discourse around visual art practice here, and he held it up against the literary practice here of the North. And because of him being one of the few, it's created this very sort of unbalanced and very linear history in terms of visual arts of this place. And I know we're all here because we accept that history is not linear. It's complicated, it's unraveling, it's very messy. So that's just sort of my caveat before I kind of tear John Hewitt to shreds a little bit. But I will conclude with him kind of criticising himself and criticising his own art criticism. So it all works out in the end. So over the next sort of 20 minutes to half an hour, I'm going to talk about an artist who had great impact on Belfast and also take the themes of this symposium and kind of stretch them. I'm going to look at war, but I'm going to look at the period between two conflicts, the Second World War and the conflict that is widely referred to as the Troubles. And I also want to look at the idea of love being care and community support, and really a notion of love and care being a radical act. And looking at these themes, I want to look at them primarily through the life of one artist, Alice Berger Hammerschlag, who came here as a result of displacement of conflict. I will also explore her involvement with the Ulster Society of Women Artists and its crucial role of the care of women artists. It could be argued that the decades in Belfast between the Second World War and the conflict have not been as extensively researched as the years leading up to and following partition. And of course, the multiple strands of historic, cultural and artistic analysis applied to the North post-1969. There have been some new studies gathered in recent years, including the recent PhD by Dick and Hall that resulted in the exhibition I co-curated upstairs on Colin Middleton. Research projects such as this have only highlighted, again, this amount of reflection and study that needs to be done to fully acknowledge that Belfast and the north of Ireland was a vibrant and creative place with huge, varied artistic and cultural activity, and was embracing the many facets of modernism within this time period. And even refer back to Tom's comments this morning about Neville Johnson and the sort of the non-heteronormative sexual practices of this community. You know, there was a lot going on here in Belfast that I think people don't ever really recognise. But of course, this was happening adjacent to growing sectarian tensions, a housing crisis, huge civil rights disparities and struggles, and an extremely conservative political climate. The women I am currently focusing on for my PhD were central to this community, specifically Alice Berger-Hammerslag, who I will speak about in more detail today. I'm attempting to create a full and rounded output of the research using feminist art historical approaches in order to fully place these women within the art history of Ireland as a whole, showing their impact and their legacy. And I know I'm speaking to many experts in this room that we know that creating a feminist history isn't about just going back and writing the women into the story, but fully analysing why they were left out of that story and that history in the first place. What are the structures of power and the cultural agencies in place in that time period of study? Additionally, questioning what are the structures of recording that have continued since that have led to them being left out of the story. And I just want to take this moment as well to point out that I'm at the very beginning of this 8-year project, and I look forward to sharing more findings in future years. I feel like I'm on a very similar serendipitous journey to Maurice at the moment, because I keep coming across all these kind of strange, sort of magical moments of research coming together. And in those many hours of research and many hours of getting lost in the Irish newspaper archive in order to map the actual activity of Berger-Hammerslag and her colleagues in the Ulster Society of Women Artists, I have learned not to be surprised about how these women have been portrayed and where they are placed in the press and the language that has been used. Often, the rigorous and important work of this exhibition group was discussed in the Women's Society pages of the local press, which was at that time a local press that did have art criticism within it. There was a space for their work to be talked about, but it was very rarely framed and such. They were often more framed in a way of sort of, look at these lovely ladies in their lovely dresses, looking at their lovely paintings. But when we look beyond, and actually, sorry, that one on the right I keep using because I think it's a really interesting image of an Alice Berger-Hammerslag exhibition that doesn't talk about the work, doesn't talk about the artist, and is a picture of a young teenage student from Queen's. And it just kind of shows you how the work was being portrayed in the media of that time. But then, as I say, when we look beyond that language of what they were actually doing, they were creating space for women and creating a network in order for women to professionally practice. I'm proposing that the love here was through care and community, but it was a professional community, in a way that this is the antithesis to the idea of the modernist artist, this idea of the male or the master alone in his studio, which a lot of Irish male artists have held up. What these women are doing was actually very similar to Mamie Jellett and Evie Hone in Dublin 30 years previously with the Irish Exhibition of Living Art. And for those who don't know in the room, apologies to many of you who've heard all my talks about Mamie Jellett, Jellett is credited with bringing abstract painting to Ireland in the 1920s, when male artists were very much looking inward to create a new Irish national identity. She set up the Irish Exhibition of Living Art as kind of a modern alternative to the Royal Hibernian Academy, and it was not gender specific, so that's what's different between her and the USWA. She was a pioneer of arts education and modernism in Ireland. I've heard a lovely story about her recently giving her keys to her studio to another woman painter who had 3 children, because she was like, have my studio, because that's how you will have space and time to make your own work. And she did that often for people. And I think also this is quite an interesting moment just to talk about a little bit about class in this study. The women I'm researching are in the majority so far from middle or upper class backgrounds. And it's definitely a pattern that I'm noticing between kind of the north and the south, that in the north there seemed to be more, the opportunities were kind of only really for people who came from sort of professional art training or a middle class, more privileged background. And those in the north who tended to not have formal training or were from working class backgrounds, such as Jared Dillon, went to Dublin, and that is where they got a lot of more support. And Nora McGuinness is another example of that. And actually, Jared Dillon, Meany Jellett, gave him his first ever solo show in Dublin. I've just forgot the name of the gallery, but really pioneered the work of an artist who didn't have formal training in a way that you just didn't really see happening in the north. So the Ulster Society of Women Artists was founded by Gladys McCabe in 1957. And who's recently unveiled blue plaque, you can actually see through the window there. I think it's just next to the stationery shop down there. She established the foundation out of a frustration, as at that time there was no art society in the north of Ireland that would accept women artists. And remember, this is 1957, so you think about sort of elsewhere in Europe what was going on. And that included the Royal Ulster Academy, so women artists couldn't exhibit as part of the Royal Ulster Academy. She set up the USWA with the ambition to support women artists of any media and education and not follow the same protocol and competition and rivalry of the academy system, but create a nurturing and supportive society. Though it was still very rigorous and had systems of shared labour, when interviewing many of the founding members recently, they've said to me that they were still very much expected to do their part. They had to sort of show a certain amount of professional output, they had to exhibit, and they also had to help others and feed into the organisation. So you couldn't kind of just join and then just be a member. It was very much a very active society. And that society still exists today with over 100 members. And Alice Berger-Hammerslag, who was pictured in the previous slide with Gladys McCabe and Deborah Brown, was one of the founding members, and she acted as the first treasurer. They exhibited widely, including their annual exhibition, which was held here at the Ulster Museum for many, many years, and they still exhibit annually. And they would also invite artists to exhibit, mostly women artists from the diaspora, so it was very much this idea of sort of, let's celebrate women who've left the north and show their successes. So Nora McGuinness was one of those, Camille Souter was another one, and Jean Osborne as well. We find actually this is a pattern that you will see a lot historically with women artists. They've often either formed groups or become part of wider exhibition groups in order to share their work with the world. And women have done this in far greater numbers than their male counterparts. Sort of going back to this idea of kind of the lone male modernist artist and master, and women grouping together. And women weren't doing this purely out of kind of like a social interest. This is because of the European art system is an imperialist system, which is set up in a way that excludes women as lone practitioners. A woman couldn't be a member of an academy, they couldn't be part of a private gallery system, they couldn't have representation in a gallery, they could not hold accounts with material suppliers, so they couldn't hold an account to go and get a canvas or paint, they couldn't sign a lease on a studio. So in order to have their work seen and hopefully sold, in order to be a professional artist, they had to be part of exhibition groups. So you find this pattern throughout art history a lot. The Surrealist group of the earliest 20th century had majority women members because it was the only place for them to be part of any kind of professional system. And this is always kind of a frustration I have, that people think that women have only been making art in the last century. Women have been 50% of artists practitioners for the last 500 years, but because of where they were doing it, it's not recorded. And sadly, in the case of the Ulster Society of Women Artists, this was also not recorded with them, which is something I'm hopefully looking to correct in the coming years. And this record of actually recording their activity and listing the exhibitions they did and the shows they had will hopefully start to shift this perception of the leaders of art here in the north, sort of being a bit more kind of evenly gendered at that time. There has been a putative canon put forward by art historians, and as I sort of alluded to in my introduction, the poet and previous art keeper of the Ulster Museum, John Hewitt, was central and foundational to this. Sadly, as I said earlier, this history was very linear and created a long-standing narrative that has left these women in the shadows, though they were very much central to artistic life here in Belfast. There is this one series of publications that exclusively deals with Northern Ireland, and it's kind of one of the only ones that exclusively deals only with the north of Ireland and only with visual art. Obviously, there's Michael's book with the Arts Council, which sort of looked at visual art and literary art, but these two are the only ones that only specifically deal with the history in general. And they were published by Blackstaff Press and the Art in Ulster series. The first was written by Hewitt and is an overarching assessment from his perspective of art created in the north of Ireland from when records began until 1957. There are 115 artist biographies in this publication, and around 8% are on women, and they're very slight. The second title in the series, Art in Ulster 2, written by Mike Caddo, covers 1957 to 1977, and it has 31 artist biographies compiled by Duÿ, and only 4 of them are on women, and the founding members of the Ulster Society of Women Artists are not mentioned at all. And that was at the time where their exhibition output was huge. I include this strange image on purpose. These actually aren't my copies. They're from the Ross's auction site, but it's just kind of, these books are like gold dust, like no one has them. So it's even the fact that there's only kind of one book produced. That book isn't really even out there. It's not in the Art College library. It's not accessible for people even to get this linear history. And it just sort of shows how important it is for the kind of more critical thinking on this time. During his time as Keeper of Art here, Hewitt curated the first one-person shows held here in the galleries. All were on male artists, including the likes of Colin Middleton and Basil Blackshaw. So all of this combined activity created an art history of the North that centred this lone male artist working in very traditional genres. Though you do see modernist influence coming through in the work of Middleton clearly, who was very inspired by the Surrealists, and to somewhat of, obviously with the works of T.P. Flanagan, there is abstraction coming through. This is when Fiona Barber reflecting on these works and this time as being a time when deep-rooted identities were increasingly coming into question in the North, and the concern for a notion of place was beginning to emerge. So everything is very much about kind of looking in and looking to the rural and looking to the landscape and to reflect, creating this kind of idea of like an Ulster identity. And yes, so this post-war time in Belfast was very much about establishing a Northern Irish identity that was conservative, masculine and inward-looking. Taking some wider European influence, as I say, but translating them into kind of this more kind of palatable Ulster aesthetic. And there are a lot of links here with the identity forming that was happening in the South post-partition and Celtic revival, and then obviously then what was happening in this period here in the North. Though I think, obviously not to criticise Hewitt, it's important to note kind of the irony of Hewitt now being seen as quite conservative, because it's actually believed that he wasn't appointed the director of the museum here in the mid-50s because of his leftist political beliefs. So, which is why he moved to Coventry. So it just kind of shows you how conservative an environment Belfast was at this time. So, why we're here. Alice Berger Hammerslag. Who was she? Born in Vienna in 1917, Alice Berger had an incredibly comfortable childhood. Her father worked for a gas and oil company, and she was exposed to all the offerings of the arts and culture of the city throughout her childhood. She showed artistic talent at a very young age and was one of the winners of an international exhibition of children's painting when she was 10, designing a poster for Milk, which she simply kept above her bed until she left Vienna. She was then, off the back of showing this kind of talent, was sent to private painting classes and began to study at the Vienna School of Art and Crafts. And then she entered the Vienna Academy of Art. But sadly, she could not complete her course before before being forced to leave Austria because of, obviously, the glowing political crisis and the treatment of Jewish people. In 1938, she was one of a small group of refugees, all with some sort of art training, who came to Northern Ireland via London with special government permission. She was the designer in the group, which included a woodworker, a leatherworker, I think a silversmith, and at first they lived in Duỗnard, which is a town about sort of 10 to 15 miles away in County Down, and they managed to obtain what actually turned out to be temporary work with various local firms. They were then sadly made redundant, and a few of them, including Alice, set up a small art shop in Bangor, which turns out I walk past every day on my way to to tech as a teenager. People have said to me this was not an ideal situation for Alice. She wasn't like a natural salesperson, and she had the best English of the group and was kind of forced into this role of the salesperson. But she also, during this time, earned a living designing greetings cards and illustrating for children's books internationally, and had quite a lucrative sort of independent income from that. In 1947, she married Heinz Hammerslag, who came to Belfast in sort of similar circumstances around the same time as her, and he came from Czechoslovakia. And she continued to work as a freelance designer following marriage and moved up here to Ulster Avenue. Her sister Joy mentioned in an interview in the 1980s that Alice kept her maiden name following her marriage, and that was sort of many of her paintings are signed Alice Berger, but it was in later years as kind of just like a nice gesture to Heinz. She decided to take Hammerslag as sort of to take that on as a double barrel in her name. Just thought it was Joy sort of said it in a nice way. It was like, just to be nice to Heinz. I thought I would do that. Through Heinz, she met the choreographer Helen Lewis, which sparked a lifelong and incredibly close friendship, which is a whole other talk. They both inspired each other in their work. There's amazing letters between them in the Linen Hall Library, and it was through Helen's involvement in the Lyric Theatre that she became the set designer and curator of the Lyric Theatre's Players' new gallery on the Grosvenor Road. And then it was in the early 50s that she began to paint, and eventually in 1960 she gave up designing and her freelance career to concentrate on painting full-time. Her work was really like no other work being produced in Belfast at that time, and she firmly sits more in, as I'm going to discuss, in a more international context of abstraction. She was incredibly interested in philosophy, different forms of spirituality, and even like synesthesia as well, which comes across in her paintings and her processes. Her interest in psychology, physics, philosophy can be found within her work, which evolved through various stages in the 50s and 60s, and she painted very much in series. Personal meaning and symbolism, connecting emotion to depictions of natural forces, were maintained throughout. Though her work was abstract, the colour choices were symbolic. Life and energy were represented with reds and earth colours, greens symbolised growth, blues and pinks stood for abstract values and positivity, whilst dull browns and blacks were the negation of life. So Cavalry Old and New encapsulates this outlook perfectly. The three cross-like shapes casting kind of a sweeping darkness across the left of the canvas symbolise suffering and despair, with white light at the top of the work, and the yellow conveys an idea of regeneration and hope. A later work, Point of Release number 2, was displayed in her exhibition at Queen's University Belfast in 1968, and it repeated this notion of darkness with hope coming through. Mercy Hunter, a very important art critic, artist, and art teacher at that time, stated, "It is painted in dull greens and reds, and there is a threatening pincer-like feature to it, out of which escapes a green globular shape. I think the symbolism here is clearly pointed." Though friends did state that she did not really talk about her experiences before Belfast, and she didn't really talk that much about, sort of in detail, about the impact of the war on her family and loved ones, she was very lucky that her mother came with her, and Heinz's mother were here, and they both cared for them here into their old age. It is clear that these events and the events of atrocity throughout the world were communicated through her work. I have found reference to one painting by her that was entitled Concentration Camp, so I know that she did at one point reference the Holocaust in her work, but I can't find it. And I do know that from interviews with her friends and family, though she didn't talk directly about the war that I'm aware of yet, she was an extreme pacifist, and she actually became a Quaker in the last 10 years of her life. So this notion of rhythms and pattern were consistent in her painting, whether through the titles or through the undulating, repetitive forms found on the canvas. This both links to her musical interest, which she shared with her husband, and to the rhythm and balances found in nature. Towards the end of the 60s, after grounding her colour experimentation, she became interested in capturing the movement and energy of light, studying in detail how to interpret it through paint, portraying its evolving and revolving beams as seen in her Streams of Light series. These studies then evolved into looking at the structure of crystals and how light interjects with their form. Multiple reviewers of her exhibited work during the 60s actually equated her painting to images of the Earth from space. And obviously the late 60s being a time when public interest and enthusiasm was on this kind of space exploration. So this demonstrates how Birger Hammerslag's painting was associated, even in Belfast, it was definitely associated with newness, exploration and excitement, and this idea of an event, which I'm going to talk about. Even this work, which was actually painted on her deathbed and was painted sort of in her last days of life, she still has this great energy and hope and immediacy to her work. And I've found reference to say that this series of drawings started off as very dark, and as she became more ill, more kind of hopeful light came through. Birger Hammerslag, as well as her own work, she inspired other artists with her work, and another Belfast local and founding member who was in that picture at the beginning, and she was a founding member of the USWA, was Deborah Brown, who has become known for her abstract work and was encouraged to explore the method by Birger Hammerslag. Hammerslag really championed the work of other local artists, such as Neil Shawcross as well, and it's this support and encouragement of others that is so important in Birger Hammerslag's impact and legacy. But back to her paintings and her choice of abstraction, it's important to note, and women turning to abstraction at this time is also sort of a very important thing to think about. Laura Smith discusses the importance of re-looking at the history of abstract expressionism in her essay for the 2023 On Women Artists Global Abstraction, Action, Gesture, Paint. And the Ulster Museum, we actually lent this work by American abstract expressionist Jo Mitchell to the exhibition. And that exhibition had hundreds of works by women artists in it, but not one work by a woman from the island of Ireland. So it just shows you sort of this lack of awareness. Smith puts forth the notion that gestural abstraction allowed these artists to define their work as immersive areas for actions, process and immediacy. Their paintings were regarded not as images, but as events. And when we look at Birger Hammerslag's work as events, we can see these paintings sitting within the canon of international abstract expressionism, a genre that was said to have grown out of the anxieties of the Second World War. Smith goes on to talk about this time in the 50s and 60s and of how, and it's been a theme of of today, how the sort of displacement of war creates a global art language and creates a global language between artists who were attempting to communicate new freedoms, but communicating these new freedoms coupled with continued grief and anxiety, and doing this through an abstract means. Alice did this through her own work, but also through sharing the work of others and bringing it to Belfast. One of these painters was Gillian Ayres, and Ayres was actually only 15 when the Second World War ended, but of course was affected and central to the new generation of artists that were creating work in post-war Britain. Beyond just abstract expressionism, the work of artists of this generation is often talked about in the context of this kind of tension between anxiety and hope, which I've already highlighted with Birger Hammerslag's work. And these young people who experienced war in youth held on to this trauma, but they were also central to new ideas and new structures of living and new structures of art. Contemporaries of Ayres were actually given the name the Duỗmmetry of Fear group, which was a term coined by art critic Herbert Reed when discussing the young sculptors of the 50s, two of which are actually on display upstairs in my current exhibition on Kelpra, Eduardo Palazzi and Elizabeth Frink. And of course, Frink is a central figure in Belfast's own visual post-war history, receiving multiple public commissions in the late 50s and early 60s here in Belfast, notably Flying Figures, which is affectionately referred to locally as Draft and Overdraft because of their placement on the side of the bank building in Shaftesbury Square. We were fortunate enough to actually save these for the public collection in the Ulster Museum this year before that building is going to be demolished, and have really excitingly discovered that they have actually been protected from the corrosion of pollution by 60 years of Irish rain. So actually public art can survive in Belfast. This work by Ayres was purchased from Birger Hammerslag's exhibition in the New Gallery by the museum, and it was purchased by Hewitt's successor, Anne Cruikshank, who arguably was really behind the Ulster Museum being the only public institution in the island of Ireland in the late 50s and early 60s to be collecting international and contemporary art and taking the museum away from this pattern of inward-looking collection. This purchase, I think, is a direct and immediate example of Hammerslag's actions creating a wider public impact. These events that she creates go beyond the events that she is creating in her paintings. Another artist who Birger Hammerslag brought to Belfast, and who's become a personal favourite of mine, and her experience was very much aligned with Birger Hammerslag's experience, was Francesca Themerson. Sadly, this painting was in the exhibition in the New Gallery, but it was not purchased by the museum, which I think is a great shame. As I said, there are close parallels between Themerson and Birger Hammerslag. Themerson was a Jewish artist who fled her native homeland of Poland in 1938, but to Paris and then to London. She worked as a children's book illustrator and stage designer alongside her painting, but she also experimented in filmmaking with her husband and dealt a lot more overtly with with conflict in her work with those films with her husband. Her work in the 60s evokes the chaotic nature of the period of history and the destabilisation of displacement, which you could definitely see in this painting. She spoke herself of trying to capture the nature of living in a strange universe. We grope around, full of fears, pleasures, anxieties and violence, joys and tragedies, stupidities and anger. Both Themerson and Ayres were actually included in the Barbican recent exhibition called Post-War Modern, which is where I found this painting. And that really held this idea of abstraction being an event at its centre, and citing the American art critic Harold Rosenberg, stating that painting would now be an arena in which to act in the 1950s in relation to work both by Ayres and Themerson. The exhibition discussed their work being immersive, immediate and participatory at the same time as capturing the overwhelm of feeling and grief following the atrocities of war. All descriptions I feel we can ascribe to Birger Hammerslag's work. This painting by Themerson in the Barbican show was in Belfast and was in the show that Alice put on in the New Gallery. So we have Birger Hammerslag's work itself, and I know I'm a wee bit over time, but I'm near the end. So we have Birger Hammerslag's work itself and her work as a curator of the New Gallery as challenging the highly conservative artistic landscape of 60s Belfast, disrupting the norm, but disrupting through care, through friendship and through collaboration. I think to conclude, it's important to go back to asking why so little is known about this incredible person and such an important figure, and who has had such lasting impact on the arts in Belfast. I have the honour, long before this PhD, I have the honour of judging her Trust Prize, which is the Alice Birger Hammerslag Trust, which is managed by the Belfast School of Art. And every year, it's wonderful to go back and see the artists that she has supported and her legacy has supported over the last 50 years, especially women who've been part of art history in this country. So Elizabeth McGill, her work from the collection, and any locals will recognise this amazing sculpture by Louise Walsh, both recipients of the Birger Hammerslag Prize early in their career. I think this invisibility is part of an age-old pattern of invisibility of women in history, but also in the context of the north of Ireland, there is something else at play. She didn't fit into the narrative of the visual culture of this place. Her global, more universal outlook didn't reflect the Ulster art that was trying to be created. And Hewitt himself in later years did mention regret of trying to be too provisional in the way he categorised and wrote about Northern Irish art. As quoted by Rian Coulter when assessing his canon making, although Hewitt was later to recognise the limitations of his idea of Ulster regionalism and admit that, the trouble was I didn't realise there were several regions in the north of Ireland, and that one region, I thought it was heavily conditioned by Protestant planter background. Then there's the isolation of abstraction itself within Ireland as a whole, as discussed by Cruikshank herself in the catalogue for an exhibition of Deborah Brown's abstract work in the New Vision Centre in London, where Hammerslag also had a solo show. She said, "It is perhaps hard for those who do not know Ireland to realise the isolation of an abstract artist in this country, where, taking into account both north and south, there would still be more than a handful of artists, there would still be not more than a handful of artists whose work is entirely non-representational. And I don't have time, but someone asked me about that in the questions, because I can explain a theory I have on this, on women artists and abstraction in the North. I think ultimately Birger Hammerslag slips between the cracks, between two places, both through her nationality and also through her time, falling between two conflicts in a place that tends to centre its cultural currency around conflict, which of course there's a place for and it's necessary, and I myself reflect on this in my wider work here at the Ulster Museum, and it's crucial and important obviously to the theme of this seminar. But I think it's also important to recognise these in-between moments and celebrate the beauty and creativity and joyous communities that were formed here, because that is how we can hold on to and celebrate the creativity and community that is happening in Belfast now. Thank you very much.